You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode 211. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. I am thrilled to have you join us here today because I have not one, not two, but three incredible guests joining me here today, and they are all on my Zoom screen, and they are so incredible. We have Betta Wishart, Catalina Rodriguez, and Cherisse Friesen, and they are all lawyers. They are all brilliant. They are all talented. They're all beautiful and accomplished lawyers. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a backstory before I turn it over to each of them to introduce themselves. Betta and I have known each other for years. We've known each other since way back in 2003. Actually, before that, 2002 and earlier, we were in law school together. She introduced me to Catalina and Cherisse in around, I'm going to say 2007, 2008. So as I understand it, the three of them were doing their bar training in Vancouver, and they regularly met, and they invited me to one of their brunches, and it was amazing. And I was delighted to be invited back. So it was really incredible. And we have stayed in touch over the years. So I continue to see Betta and Catalina and Cherisse. You might recognize Catalina from an earlier podcast episode when she came to talk about courageous conversations. And I was out recently at an event for women lawyers, and I saw Cherisse. And Cherisse came up to me and she said, Paula, I have a really great idea for a podcast episode. What if we talked about nonlinear career paths for lawyers? And I love the idea. And I love the idea of Cherisse talking about her career path as a lawyer. And so that was the starting point of what is today's podcast episode. So we reached out to Betta and to Catalina, and we now have the three of them here today to talk about their respective career paths. And between the four of us, so I'm not going to talk about my path today, but between the four of us, in the last, however many years that is, we have produced 7 humans. Yes, that is 7 humans, not bad. And doing rough math, at least a dozen career transitions. So what's really impactful about this conversation is that lawyers will often talk about pivots, and they'll have questions about nonlinear paths and what if I take this job and it's the wrong decision, or all these questions. And we all have this, we hear, right? We know that intuitively pivots are great and you can always change roles and you can always zigzag your way to where you need to be. But in the abstract, it's kind of empty. And so to have 3 amazing women who are so accomplished, and you will love hearing from them, it puts so much more color and context into what that actually looks like. So with that, I am going to ask each of these incredible women to introduce themselves, and I'm going to start with Cherisse.
Thanks, Paula. And thanks for that introduction. I've enjoyed getting to know all of you over the years. It's been really wonderful. And that's the wonderful thing about transitioning in law too. You meet all kinds of interesting people along the way. So just briefly, in terms of my history, I started my legal career anyway at a national firm in downtown Vancouver. I had a summer job there and I articled there. I was an associate there and then eventually partner. So that's how I started my first, say, 9, almost 10 years of practice. And then at some point, then I transitioned to an in-house counsel position with the public guardian and trustee in their child and youth division. And then I was there for about 4.5 years. And then I transitioned to my current position, which is a barrister with the BC Ministry of Attorney General. So that's where I currently work. So I've spent essentially an equal amount of time in private practice and the public service now. So as we move along, I just wanted to say that I'll have a lot of things to say about career transitions, but these views are all my own. They're not views of government.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Cherisse. Now we would love to hear from Betta.
Hello. Hello, Paula. Hello, Cherisse and Catalina. And hello, everyone listening today. You'll hear some similarities between and some overlap between Cherisse and my journey and some areas where we diverge. Most notably being that Cherisse and I hail from the same home province of Manitoba, but I returned. So I'm speaking to you from Winnipeg, Manitoba. So my background, I also summered an article with a national law firm in their Montreal office because I had done my law degree at McGill and stayed on to as a summer student, an articling student with a national firm there. But my first couple of transitions were quite quick because once I was called, I worked for about 6 months in the Montreal office before I transferred to that same firm's Vancouver office. And maybe later on in the podcast, we can talk about some of the reasons for why I transferred offices so early in my first year of call. I then worked at the Vancouver office of this law firm for about a year before I took an in-house job with, again, hearkening to Cherisse's experience, I went in-house with the public guardian and trustee in British Columbia, where I was doing privacy law work for them and communications. So we can talk later there too, in that I was both doing legal work and some non-legal work, which was interesting and developed skills for me there that I wouldn't have had if I'd been doing solely legal work. So that was interesting. And then after, I think it would be about 6 or 7 years with the public guardian trustee in Vancouver, I moved home to Winnipeg with a husband, a 2.5-year-old and a 2-month-old in tow, and set up life back in my hometown and worked for a few years with the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority, doing privacy work there before I transitioned to the Law Society of Manitoba, where I work as program counsel and French language services counsel. So that's the career trajectory. And of course, it's funny when you summarize it all in 6 bullet points here, knowing all the emotions and all the debates and the pro and con lists that went into all those moves. It's obviously not as clean and it's beautifully messy in the transitions. So that's what I have to say for now.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Betta. And I have lots of things I want to say about both of you, but I'm going to hold on and ask Catalina to please introduce herself.
I like the mention of beautifully messy, Betta, because sometimes that's the only way you can look at it after so many changes. My legal career started back in Colombia, where I'm from, and I went to law school there at the ripe age of 18. I practiced with a global law firm when I was a law student. And then upon immigrating to Canada, I went to UBC Law School and I summered an article with a national firm. I became an associate when that national firm had become a regional labor and employment firm in Vancouver. And I stayed with them for 2 years. And then I made the move in-house to a large corporation in the retail space. And I was with them for 8 years, the last of which was, I went over to the human resources department within the organization. I went from being their employment lawyer to being a director of HR. After that, I went back to private practice. I thought it was going to be that I was not going to be able to do it, but I did it. I went back to private practice for several months, and then I went back in-house in the banking sector this time. And after 4 years in banking, I went back to private practice, and I am with a small law firm in South Surrey, and I've been there for 4 years now.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Betta, we're going to start with you. And the first question is, how did you know that it was time to leave private practice at a law firm?
I think to the decision about when I needed to leave, probably I want to just sort of go a little earlier than that decision in to say that my decision to go to law school was probably the first inkling anyone would have had that my career path would be nonlinear, in that I went to law school thinking, I think it'd be really interesting to study law. I've heard you can do really interesting things with a law degree. Maybe I want to be a lawyer. Maybe I want to use my law degree differently. I'm not sure, but I think I'm going to pursue a law degree and see where it leads. So I wasn't sure exactly what the practice of law or what kind of lawyer I was going to be when I went to law school. And I think at the time, which would have been, I started my law degree in 1999. At the time, the most sort of visible way to qualify as a lawyer and article was with law firms. And that was certainly the most prevalent and prominent sort of path that was visible to me as a law student, right? And a lot of my friends were applying for summer jobs. And I thought, well, that would get me a good varied kind of experience at a law firm. I get to look at different areas of practice. So I summered, really enjoyed the law firm I summered with, was offered an articling position, and kind of ended up, I sort of ended up on the path to articling and to being called and starting into private practice. But in some ways, when hindsight is 2020, and I think I was swept along on a path that I didn't necessarily intentionally seek out. And so I think that once I got into practicing law in that environment, I started to feel that there was a disconnect between what I was doing and really what I'd sort of hoped to do with my law degree. It wasn't looking forward to my work the way I wanted to be, and also the way that I think, the job deserved. I was doing the work, but I wasn't feeling passionate about it, and I wasn't feeling excited by it. And as I tell my children when they whine about going to school, I say, well, not every day is meant to be a thrill ride of excitement. So I did have that, in the sense of, I'm not saying that I expected every day to be a thrill ride of excitement. And certainly some days were very stressful thrill rides of excitement. But I just felt there was a disconnect between what I'd imagined I'd be doing with my law degree and where I ended up. And so I think it was at that point that I really felt that I couldn't see myself wanting to do this for years and years. And it's demanding. The practice of law can be demanding. It's fulfilling, but it can be very demanding. And while no one's promising you a thrill ride of excitement, I think you do need to feel that overall sense of, I'm where I need to be. I'm where I meant to be. This feels right. So it was just a persistent daily feeling of, this is not right for me. Does that sort of answer the question?
It is a beautiful answer, Betta. And okay. I mean, I think what you shared speaks to the story of so many lawyers and law students who go to law school because they're interested, they're curious. Is the right thing for me? And what I love about the way you explained how you knew, number one, is taking that step back, because once you step into the position of lawyer at large firm, it feels like that's the only path. That's how a lot of people describe it to me. And I know that's how I felt. Mm-hmm. And so to be able to tune into yourself and recognize, okay, there's a disconnect here, and then to act on that, I think takes so much courage, and it takes that self-reflection. It takes faith that there's something else out there that you're going to enjoy. And so I think that's a story that will resonate with so many people. And so I appreciate you sharing that with us. Thank you. And I'm going to take your thrill ride. When your parenting technique, next time anyone complains about anything.
No one promised you a thrill ride of excitement.
I love it. Love it. And I could ask each of you about your various transitions, but we're going to kind of pick different themes for different questions. So Catalina, this next question is for you, and it's one that a lot of lawyers ask me about, right? Which is making a transition to going in-house. And so for you, your transition, I believe the first transition to in-house, right? I mean, you moved countries, but then the transition to in-house, I would love to hear from you. We would love to hear from you. What prompted you to make that move, and how the experience of going in-house compared to your expectations before going in?
It exceeded all my expectations, Paula. I didn't know what to expect going in-house, and I had so much fun in my first in-house job. I was not feeling motivated when I was in private practice, and I loved the people around me. It was a law firm full of incredible talent that I was very lucky to have learned from, but it was stale. I mean, a lot of law firms are stale. They're for sure not a thrill of excitement. And I was very concerned about the billable hour. I had not gotten used to it. It takes time to get used to the fact that you have to bill and you have to charge for what you know, or sometimes what you don't, but for what you don't, you're not even sure that you know. And that was a very uncomfortable feeling. And I go in-house and I don't have to bill. There's no billable time. And I was plopped into an organization that had an entrepreneurial spirit and an energy that I did not know. I didn't know it was possible. I was like, wow. And conversations were not just about the law. They were about operations and finance and impact on the customer. And this fed my soul to have all these conversations from perspectives that were not just the legal perspective. So it exceeded all my expectations.
Cherisse, turning over to you. You described at the beginning of our conversation how you started at a national firm as a summer student, articling student, associate, and then partner. So you really took the steps that are the traditional steps to partnership in a law firm. And then you chose to leave the partnership and move over to the public guardian and trustee. So I would love if you would share with our listeners what prompted you to leave the partnership at your firm to go to the PGT.
It was an interesting journey because a lot of what Betta said kind of resonated with me in terms of the journey in private practice. I think when I started law school, I didn't exactly know what I wanted to do, but I sort of got into the habit of saying yes to things, which I think served me really, really well. And the path that's often presented to you when you are in law school is, this is the obvious path to go into private practice and to go be at a big firm, get some interesting, exciting files. And I did that. And actually, it was really great. It was a really great experience. And I had some good work and I worked with some really talented people. And it's great training ground. And it was really good for a long time. And I think in terms of prompting the move, there's also always a multitude of reasons why I think people make moves like that. I think one of the more obvious ones was I had a toddler, I had a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I probably hadn't slept for a couple of years, really through the night, probably at that point in time. And, at that point you start to think, okay, what do I want? I can't say yes to everything like I used to. How do I want to manage this? How do I want to balance all of this? And one option that people often talk about is working part-time. And I knew that wasn't right for me. I think that's right for some people to do in terms of trying to sort of manage at that point in your life if you're a parent of young children. So I think that works well for a lot of people. I didn't think it would work well for me. I just knew my personality. I kind of thought I would probably end up working the same amount of money, but just taking a voluntary pay cut. And I wasn't sure how I would manage that in litigation and feel happy about it. So I started to consider some other options. And what drew me to the PGT's office in particular was its mandate, really. I was very drawn to it. They protect the legal and financial interests of children and youth in British Columbia. And the organization's mandate was something that I found very intriguing and meaningful to me. And I was interested in supporting that work. So instead of leaving, when you make a transition, it's best if you're moving towards something you're interested rather than moving away from something a situation where you don't want to be. So I felt like I was moving towards something that I was really interested in. And the transition was a great one. It really was. It took a lot of planning. I had to just, think it through. But I was very happy with that transition, and my work there had room for a lot of compassion, which I really appreciated. And I felt like I was working with a team where we had a shared vision, and I really enjoyed that time there.
Cherisse, I'm going to throw you a bit of an extra question, which is how you made that transition. Because a lot of lawyers who are making a transition, let's say from private practice to in-house, get concerned about, well, what about all the time I've invested here? What about all the relationships that I've made here? Like, I can't leave. And if you're open to it, I would love if you would maybe share a little bit about how you managed that aspect of the transition, the idea that you were stepping away from something that you clearly worked very hard to achieve.
That is a difficult part of making transitions, I think, is that you sort of built that capital in the place where you are, and they know you. Your colleagues know you. They trust you. And there was a lot of hard work that goes into building those relationships. I think it's important to remember that those relationships aren't over when you leave. And that's certainly something that I would say to people when you make any transitions. keep in touch with the people that you connected with in your old job. And probably there are people that you felt like you could pick up the phone and talk to at any time. Maybe walk down the hallway. It used to be you walk down the hallway and talk to them at any point. Those are the people now that you will pick up the phone and call. You'll need those sort of lifelines. I think that in terms of, making the, leaving that behind, so to speak, because to some extent you do, it is, important to be patient with yourself, patient with people around you. I think there's a culture shock, especially in a transition like that. And it may not feel at first like it's the right decision. I will be honest. There were moments where I thought, I don't know if I made the right choice, but that's just part of the transition. And you just need to give the new opportunity time and space, and not get too discouraged about you're not starting from the ground up like you were when you were an articling student, and just to keep that in mind, and just rely on your own instincts in terms of what worked before. Just sort of put your head down and keep at it again.
Thank you so much, Cherisse. And one thing of many that really resonated is that sometimes that decision isn't going to feel, it's not going to feel easy, right? These decisions are challenging, right? This is why people often struggle with the pivots and the decisions to move from job A to job B, because it's not always clear. So thank you for that. Betta, this next question is for you. You have transitioned from Vancouver to Winnipeg, and a lot of lawyers are thinking about doing something similar, right? Whether it's moving from Vancouver.
Moving to Winnipeg, it's on the bucket list for many people.
I'm so glad you're here. You're amazing. But this is the thing. And so what advice do you have for someone who's in a city where they're thinking about moving somewhere else, right? Maybe they're thinking of moving from a smaller city to a bigger city, or a bigger city to a smaller city, or even within a relatively contained geographical distance. What advice would you have about some of the challenges and opportunities that are connected to that?
Well, yeah, it's interesting because what Cherisse was saying about the networks and the relationships that are built. And I think certainly in speaking about my experience and my husband, who's also a lawyer, who was transferring. So we were both transferring to Winnipeg, and trying to, sort of establish ourselves here. Certainly going from a large centers like Montreal, where I had been working, and then in Vancouver, where we'd been, to Winnipeg, moving to a smaller center, I can sort of say that when you are moving somewhere that most of the people at the time when we transferred out here, if you were a lawyer in Manitoba, typically you had done your undergraduate work and your legal education at the University of Manitoba. And it's a smaller center. There are less firms. There are less corporate headquarters here. And the people that are here have grown up here. I would say that's changing now. And maybe we can talk about a little bit more about that from the work that I do at the Law Society now. I do see a lot more immigration into Manitoba and a lot more internationally trained lawyers who are moving in. So I see more movement here now, even in the time since I moved back in 2012. But my husband and I both found that coming into a smaller city where friendships and relationships and networks have been building since law school, and they've been building since law school and have continued throughout the articling positions, throughout the firms. And we have many firms, the firms here, there are sometimes several generations of a family at that firm. So it's just smaller. So it was daunting. And so again, to Cherisse's point about there were moments where we went, oh my, like we really feel like outsiders here. Like, when you're in a room full of lawyers here and they all talk about such and such professor because they've all had them and their father and mother had them, you really felt like there was a language that you couldn't speak. But so that's where being prepared for that fish out of water feeling, knowing that it takes time to build those relationships, start learning the shorthand and getting involved. Like my husband, I was home with little kids for the first year and a half after we moved back, but my husband joined the board of the beautiful Tourism Manitoba. Is going to send me a check after this, but the beautiful Winnipeg Children's Museum, he got on the board of that. Like he volunteered his time because that was a way to meet some people. So just, joining the Manitoba Bar Association. So just, I think, and it probably equally, it's funny, you could almost reverse that. You could see how, although it's maybe easier to move to a Montreal or a Vancouver or Toronto is used to more of an influx of new people and are more open to it, equally there's such big centers. You're still trying to establish a foothold, right? And so I think seeking out those opportunities to participate in professional bar associations, to volunteer on boards where you can do work that's meaningful to you, but you build some connections. That was huge and helpful. And then also just giving it time and knowing that you might have some tearful nights where you go, oh my gosh, this has been a big change, and change is scary. And it's not easy peasy to just transplant yourself. It takes time. So I think those were some of the challenges and how we sort of tried to address those.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Betta. And I love that you highlighted on the community aspect as well, that a move like that isn't just a career-related move. It's a community-related move, and that you're going to find yourself, even when you're returning home, right? You mentioned This is your home province, your home city. It can still be quite an adjustment.
Well, yes. And I mean, when I lived here, I wasn't a mom when I lived here. So I came home and had to figure out, well, what preschool do I, whereas, people who, coming here, it was figuring out, okay, well, what do I need to get my kids enrolled in? And we were figuring out a whole way of living, even though it was my home. And I see Catalina nodding on our podcast. And I mean, equally, she had to adapt from an entirely different country and continent to that. So giving yourself grace, and time. And I think the last thing I'd say, because I know we want to cover a lot, but just realizing too that even since I got home to Winnipeg, I've had 2 job moves here. So, I mean, just being open to, okay, even if where you've landed, and my first job was a great one here, but I took it and pretty quickly knew I wasn't going to stay forever at the Winnipeg Regional Health Authority, but I got a lot out of it. And while I was learning and working there, I was continuing to build sort of connections with other people and learn more about the job market here and learn more about what might be interesting to me. And then when the right move and job came, or the right job came along, I was able to apply for it. So just, not feeling that if you haven't found the exact right position right out of the gate, that somehow you've done something wrong. No, it's, careers evolve. The important thing is just to keep moving forward and keep checking in with yourself and trust that you'll get something out of each position.
Amazing. Thank you, Betta. Catalina, now we're coming back to you, and we're asking about the transition back into private practice. So you mentioned this transition from private practice into in-house was liberating in many ways, and now you're back in private practice. And so I would love it if you would share with our listeners what made you decide to go back into private practice, and how your experience of being in-house has influenced the way that you practice as a lawyer in private practice.
The first time that I decided to go back to private practice, I was doubting myself. And I called Cherisse and I said, I'm doubting myself. And she said, there is a partner at my firm, came from the corporate world, and she came back to private practice and she became a partner here. Why don't you talk to her? And I did. And this woman was instrumental in just saying, of course you can do it. Nobody's doubting it. Why are you? Right? I'm like, oh, okay. So I went back to private practice, and then I went to the bank. And to your point, Paul, after 4 years in the bank, I am now back in private practice, and I've been in private practice for 4 years. It did change the way in which I approach practicing law. I think because it made me even more focused on the practical aspects of my legal advice. As it is, I am not a very theoretical person. It's just not part of my personality. I'm not an academic when it comes to the law. But once you've seen your legal advice in action, you know that there are things that don't matter, right? Like whether the Court of Appeal is still debating the point and we're hoping for a Supreme Court of Canada clarification. No one cares, truly. Is how do we implement your advice and what happens if we get it wrong? So you become very focused on the risk evaluation of things and the impact that any option would have on your stakeholders and everyone else. Because I was also so close to the human resources department in all of the in-house positions that I've had, I truly enjoy that conversation with HR when they are my client now that I'm in private practice. And I'm also able to raise some of the flags that they know would come for them in the way that they present the advice internally and try to implement it.
Excellent. It sounds very practical. I used to work with a lawyer who was a commercial lawyer who'd spent a number of years in-house. And the question that lawyer was always asking was, so what? So what does this matter to the client? So I love how you put that.
Is the so what, but it's also the why, Paula, because you as a lawyer also bring very good input into why are we doing what we're doing. And don't ever be afraid when you're sitting at the table to say, okay, well, it's great that you want to do it. Why do you want to do it? Before you launch into your legal advice and then the pros and the cons is the why. You should always start there, really.
Thank you, Catalina. Cherisse, this is a question for you, and it is about your transition from being at the PGT, where I gather you weren't doing court work, to where you are now, where I gather you are doing court work. You're back into litigation in a very practical way. And so, question for you is, what was it like to return to litigation after taking a break of about 4.5 years? And one of the reasons I think this question is relevant is for all those lawyers who are either going back into a practice area that they were once in, that maybe they've spent a few years out, lateral hires who are joining, maybe it's a different group that they weren't in before. So we'd love to hear your experience about what that experience was like and what you might recommend to somebody who is in a similar position.
Yes, thanks. I think it's a really interesting experience. And you're right. I wasn't doing, traditional litigation work at the PGT's office. They were litigation files, but I wasn't in court really, for example. So it was a different kind of practice. It wasn't running a file in the traditional way. So it wasn't sort of having a classic litigation practice. And it's true that over a period of time, there's some skills that you've built. I think when you start off articling and when you're a barrister and you go through, those early associate years, you learn a lot. You learn a lot about not only the law, but how to practice law. And we go to law school, we don't learn a lot about that in law school, like the day-to-day decision-making process that you go through on your files, strategic decisions, how to deal with opposing counsel, how to deal with a client, all of those things that we don't study in law school, but you learn on the ground when you're practicing. That stuff is really important. And if you don't exercise it all the time, you may lose some of those skills because you gain them and it becomes kind of intuitive how you want to run your file. And so a lot of it becomes intuitive over time. And I was still doing a little bit of that, but not in the same way. So yeah, so the transition was, I knew there was going to be a transition time where I'd have to sort of get back into that swing of it. And I was right. I think it was a little more, getting back was a little slower than I had anticipated. So I guess number one is have some patience with the process. And what Catalina said earlier really resonated with me too. You have to kind of just believe in yourself. We did it before, we could do it again. It doesn't mean that it feels comfortable all the time. It really doesn't. But, you go to your friend, get a pep talk, go talk to people, get a pep talk and keep going. I think that's one piece of advice. The other is that I think, you can get up to speed on the law again. We know how to do that. We're trained to do that. We can go to textbooks. We can do a lot of reading. We can figure it out. But the other part of it to support that process in transitioning is connecting with people. And I'm a big believer in that because you can get a lot of information just from talking to your colleagues and mentors, people who've been in an organization for a really long time. Seek out the people who really know what's going on, connect with them, go for coffee, or even just chat in their office. I'm not always the best at doing that because I tend to kind of get to focus in on my work and just keep plugging away at my work in my office and not necessarily take the time and go start chit-chatting to people, but I always get something out of it. And when I did transition, I did make a point of actually sitting down and talking to people, either over lunch or coffee or something like that. And it makes a big difference. And it's one of those kind of things that I think you can easily forget about doing, but it's part of, learning the unspoken skills that people have when they practice law. And when inevitably you have questions that arise on your files or what to do, it'll help you navigate that circumstance. It'll help you to know where to go. For me personally, I find sounding boards really helpful. I find talking through, if I hit a wall on a file, really helpful. So I know who to go to. I know who knows the problem I'm talking about and who can listen and help. So I would say that was one of my number one tips for people is to connect with others. And it's harder to do when people are working remotely, but so valuable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you. Betta, turning to you now, as I understand it in your role, are designing professional development for lawyers. So what I would love to know from you is, with the background that you have from your own career and some of the transitions that you've made, the experiences that you've had, how has this influenced the way that you approach lawyer development? And what skills do you think lawyers need to thrive?
Yeah, those are big questions. I think that to answer the first one, which was, how my transitions have affected how I view lawyer professional development, I think may sound very obvious, but I think coming at the development of continuing professional education programs, knowing that there is a variety of possible careers in law. There are different types of practice, and there are, the education needs in the different areas of practice and the different type of workplaces may require different emphases. So, and that speaks to the breadth of programming that we try to do. So there may be the pure substantive legal programs that's purely about, substantive changes in the law, but also making sure that there are, research and writing programs and advocacy skills programs. And I think also something that is important, and Catalina was talking about lawyers who are working and are dealing with business interests or HR interests, like incorporating, I'm using quotation marks here, air quotes, law adjacent experts, knowing that if you're doing a program on child protection, not only do we need to know about the key cases that are going to be heard, there's been leave granted to appeal to the Supreme Court, but equally hearing from psychiatrists on how to deal with children who have developmental disabilities or families with intergenerational trauma and addiction and how to serve those families. So realizing that education can come from in a variety of forms and in a variety of ways. And I think one other thing, and I think there's been a lot of discussion, I know there's been a lot of discussion in the legal profession about health and wellness and encouraging lawyers to seek out assistance and to speak more freely about it and reduce stigma about mental health. I think that not only being mindful of offering discrete programs on health and wellness, but also even when lawyers are engaged in education and professional development that's substantive law based, there are always opportunities for mentorship and for seasoned or experienced or the expert presenters to speak from their own experiences. And it's funny because I'm finding so many, it just feels like, although this is unscripted, our answers are unscripted, so much is crossing over. I think some of the most powerful education sessions we offer are when we have, obviously you're getting senior lawyers or judges to present to the practicing lawyers. It can be very powerful when a senior lawyer or a judge speaks to something they went through, something they struggled with, something that they navigated during their career. That is extremely powerful. So I think I try to have all of those things in mind, and I encourage those who are teaching and involved in programs to educate, and particularly in terms of professional development for junior lawyers, is just making sure that everyone feels that we are a community, that there is a legal community out there. And I think that it is adversarial. I realize it can be adversarial in the litigation field. I still see over and over the collegiality in the community and the desire for there to be more community and mentorship, and unfailingly, the lawyers and that I speak to, the senior lawyers who present for us, will say, if you have any questions, call me, and they mean it, right? So those are sort of the things that I bring with me, and those are the things that were meaningful for me when I was going through my changes. Yeah, my career changes.
Amazing. Thank you so much. But it is true. It's so powerful to hear other people's stories. And one of the reasons I'm so glad that the three of you are here today sharing your stories, because I know everyone listening I'm inspired. I'm confident others are as well. couple more questions and then we're going to wrap up for today. Catalina, I receive a lot of questions about transferable skills for lawyers, and I would love to ask you what your thoughts are on what the key transferable skills are.
I think whether you're in private practice or in-house, having people skills is key. Knowing that behind every problem, there is a human who is dealing with that problem. There is either a business person who is struggling to work something out, or your client, wherever they come from, when you're in private practice, this is weighing on them, and it's weighing on them heavily, and they can't sleep at night. And you have to deal with the human first. And I think that is very much a transferable skill. This one's funny, but I think Excel, knowing a little bit of Excel is a transferable skill.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I don't know how you survive as a lawyer without Excel, in my experience, right? I know maybe some people don't need it, but in the corporate world, it would serve you really well because most people are proficient on Excel and you will be sent information in Excel. So exercising that muscle of getting confident and competent in understanding math in an Excel spreadsheet will serve you well and be able to do your own formulas and whatnot for sure. And also curiosity, Paula. Curiosity will serve you well no matter what kind of law you're practicing or where, because asking the right questions is what helps you to get to the bottom of the problem. And when you are in-house, you have to be curious about the business that you are working with. You cannot survive and will not survive if you are worried only about the legal aspect that comes at your desk and you're not informing yourself about what kind of business this organization is in and what does it take for this business to succeed. And back in private practice, I think the same will be true if you understand how a law firm works as a company, as a service provider, and what makes that law firm successful and how you can contribute to the success of the law firm. If you just sit down every day and do your work and don't realize that you have a certain obligation of marketing yourself and being entrepreneurial about it, I don't know that you will succeed as much. That's the way I view the world. Curiosity will take you far.
Thank you so much, Catalina. Cherisse, the next question is for you. And we've touched on this a little bit in terms of the instincts, right? The going with your gut and knowing that it's time to make a transition. And also the practical realities of what that actually feels like, right? Betta talked about going from Vancouver to Winnipeg and how there was a very real adaptation period of integrating into a new community. So I would love it if you would share with us how you would approach balancing that going with your gut with the practical realities of switching jobs.
Yeah, I think that the going with your gut thing is, I think that's really important. But it's also a little bit of honing in on what you really want. Betta talked earlier about, not necessarily having that in the forefront of her mind in those early days in her career. Just, you sort of get busy and you kind of just keep marching forward. And I think it's your gut that's kind of telling you, maybe there's something else that, you're not fully consciously thinking about all the time because it's not the immediate priority in your day is to kind of think about your wants and desires, like in terms of, your greater interests in your career pursuits. But if you stop and quiet yourself down a little bit and listen to the gut would be the first step, I think, is just the initial step. And I think it actually helps to write things down. If you write down what you want, and I know that I'm not a career counselor by any stretch, but aligning your, listing your values and finding jobs that align with your values. I think that's really important first step. The practical realities, of course, in the transition is something different because, there's even a dream job may have its challenges, and it's helpful always to know what you're getting into. That's for me anyway. You can deal with things, but it's nice to know in advance what it is you're going to deal with. So that's a really important part for me. So when I made the transition out of private practice in that first stage in the public service, I talked to a lot of people. And Betta will know this because I picked up the phone and I called Betta. And so she gave me, a lot of information about what the day-to-day world might look like in that organization. She gave me the names of 2 other people to talk to, and I called them. And I am so thankful that I did that work because it was a huge transition for me. And I had built, a practice that I wasn't just going to walk away from without a lot of thought. So I did a lot of research, and I'm happy that I did that in terms of, I got a sense of the office culture. I got a sense of what the day-to-day work was like. And that was enormously helpful for me. And it certainly, like, when you have those moments of doubt, when you make the transition, which often does come along with transitions, then that helps in that kind of transition stage. So that was really good. And I think that knowing that you can know when you're making a transition, there's what you read on paper on, that organization's website or whatever the case may be. But knowing the culture, I think, is really important. And that's where talking to people really, really helps. And pay attention to red flags that people may not. Hopefully they're very candid with you. You're talking to someone who you can have a candid conversation with, but they may not be fully candid for all kinds of reasons. And you want to read between the lines sometimes too. If you get the sense that there's red flags, in terms of, maybe everybody's leaving or something like that. There may be good reason for that too. But just as an example, there may be red flags, and pay attention to those in the transition. Maybe, if you're not prepared to deal with some of those, then maybe that's not the right move. And in terms of the last transition that I did back into litigation, I knew in advance that it would mean that it would make more demands on my time. And so that was something that I had to think about and talk to my family about. And we had very frank conversations about that. Okay, so this is, when there's a trial or a hearing, you can't just work 9 to 5. Your hours are quite different. So we went into that. I say we because I think it was something that you speak to your partner about. You make the decisions together in terms of like what that future will look like. And so, we went into it knowing what that entails. And even though a transition like that may be challenging, if you know in advance what you're walking into, I think that's enormously helpful because everybody knew what. Well, there's always surprises, right? Of course, but yeah, I mean, it just, if you're prepared, it makes a big difference.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, all of you. You've shared so many amazing tips and strategies and ideas, and I appreciate it enormously. And I know everyone who's listening feels the same way. Before we wrap up, quick question for each of you, and it's the same question. If you were to time travel back to the sort of mid-2000 era or whatever time frame you would choose, what is one thing that you would tell your younger self in terms of advice? Betta, you're first.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, one thing. There's probably a myriad of things in various areas that I probably would have calmed my mind if I'd had someone time travel to tell me. I think that I would tell myself to think carefully about what kind of work I think I want to do and then what kind of path I want to be on. And I know that's not always easy because you go off to law school, you don't know exactly what you're going to expect. There were the people who knew right in that they wanted to do. I have one of my dearest friends knew from day one that she wanted to be a labor lawyer, and she is. And, and that's all she's ever wanted to do, and it fit. But I'd say a lot of us don't know going in. But just once you get onto a path, I would say try and take those moments to check in with yourself that you still feel like you're on the right path. And that you're on it because you want to be there, and you can still identify the reason that it makes sense for you to be on that path, and that you're not on it because of expectations you're now putting on yourself or expectations that you think other people have of you. And again, easier said than done when and I mean, there's so many, we could talk for so long about, you also need a paycheck, right? You also need, you have rent to pay and, so you don't have especially what, there are other factors that are keeping you on the path you are on or in the job that you're in. And I understand that. And so, but I just think as and when time, carve out moments to just check in and say, okay, you know what? I'm on this path because I want to be on it, and because it makes sense for me to be on it at this point. And I'm here because I want to be, not because I think other people think I should be here, or I've now incorporated other people's expectations into what my career path should be. I just want to close on saying the one thing that we are all privileged as, and every single person who's got a law degree and is practicing law or, in a legal field job, is we are so privileged that we have the education that we do, that we can look around and make those changes as hard as they are. But it's a privilege to be able to do that. So trust yourself, rely on the fact that you've got a great education behind you. And if the path you're on is not the right one for you, that you'll find the right one.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Betta.
Yep.
Catalina, what's the one thing you would say to your younger self?
The first one will be to have taken law school less seriously. And by that, I mean to have rested more and worked less. I had many goals that I was trying to achieve as I was going to law school, and articling didn't get any better. It was equally stressful. And eventually my body sent me a bill. And I think I could have rested more and slept more and read less. And the second thing is to ask for help. To Cherisse's point of talk to people who are doing things and reach out to folks about things that you're interested in. I wish I had done that during law school, and I didn't. And I was as confused as many of us were about where do we want our career to go. And I didn't think that I could ask for help. Unfortunately, there's people like you, Paula, putting it out there in the legal profession that coaching is a thing, that you have resources that would help you figure out what you like and to map a career plan. And I think that would have been invaluable for me earlier on.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Catalina. Cherisse, what is the one thing you would share with your younger self?
Well, one of the first things that came to my mind when you asked that question was just the phrase sort of just keep doing what you're doing. Not that I didn't make mistakes. I absolutely did, but just it's all part of, I'm just happy where I've ended up. And I think it was all part of the learning experience. And when you kind of feel like you're sidetracked and doing something that isn't right for you or whatever, or you have a setback, I know it's maybe trite to say, but it's kind of just part of it and it'll all kind of work out. Like that's, don't worry, it'll all kind of work out kind of thought comes to mind. But when Catalina was talking, I was thinking, it sort of got me thinking a little bit too about some parts of it. I know it all works out, but some parts of it are difficult, right? And I think I would probably say, don't listen to the negative people around you. There's a lot of people have a lot of opinions about you and your practice, especially in litigation. You hear there's some fantastic people, there's some amazing people, there's some not so amazing people, and you'll encounter them. And maybe sometimes you work with them. Don't listen to those people. Find the people who are supportive. They're out there. There's probably more than you think. Connect with them. Stay focused on them. Don't focus on the people who are the negative people in your life.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you again, Betta, Catalina, and Cherisse for joining us here today. Thank you to everybody who has tuned in for today's episode. It's been amazing reconnecting with you. It's been thrilling. And so thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. And I hope to see everybody again next week. Bye for now. If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.